Hi, I'm Rebecca Beavers with the U.S. National Park Service. I'm a geologist and oceanographer with a focus on coastlines. My co-author for this section focused on sea level rise hazard and risk assessment is Dr. Maria Caffrey of the University of Colorado, also in the United States, located in Boulder, Colorado. With sea level rise, we are looking at varying predictions. These predictions are currently based on representative concentration pathways. What we have been looking at lately, given information and models that have been incorporated in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, are RCP scenarios of 2.6 up to 8.5. Not getting into the details behind those scenarios, what we are recognizing now is really many of these scenarios are actually very conservative. We have pretty much surpassed what we would see from RCP 2.6. And for many agencies and governments who are planning, we are certainly looking at the higher emission scenarios and the impacts associated with those types of emissions. Now, when we have these predictions, we also have to recognize that sea level is one of the hazards that is not one that can be treated in isolation. Oftentimes, you will see these impacts from sea level in locations that are also prone to other hazards. And the framework that we're working with here also recognizes other hazards such as flooding and coastal erosion. But many of these cities, our major metropolitan areas located on these coastlines, do have this underlying baseline risk from sea level. Since we have quite an international audience with this, we must point out that not every place on the globe is currently experiencing sea level rise. There are a couple locations up in the Arctic and other places where you've had unloading from ice, and so maybe isostatic rebound, where actually the land is still rising relative to the water level. But in general, that relative rate of sea level rise is something that is of a concern in our major urban and rural areas along our shorelines. Some of the data that we can look at to help us indicate what are your local and regional risk related to sea level come from a variety of agencies and entities around the globe. Some of those are highlighted in our section, and so I would refer you to those for more specifics. It's really important as you start looking at this particular hazard, what sea level rise scenario you are looking at. I started this presentation with some of the RCP scenario-based information, and yet you also have to look at some of your local considerations, such as what is the land motion doing. Those are some of the secondary hazards that come into play, along with storm surge, groundwater intrusion, et cetera. The models that we're using have varying levels of accuracy. Part of that's due to the model parameters themselves, but also the available information used to put into those models. Now, when we are addressing sea level rise, we have to recognize there are concerns such as the willingness across all scales to address this particular topic, on an intergovernmental all the way down to the individual scale. We do have to invest in planning to manage risk, and some of the prior presentations in the webinar today certainly went into much of that information. Some of the secondary hazards to focus in on that, because this is where many people will begin to see some of the impacts of sea level. We are dealing with an entity where we have millions of people living within our flood zones. And there is current discussion where our 100-year flood zones are currently potentially not enough to plan for the hazards facing these people. Oftentimes we're recognizing we may need to be looking at what we would have called a 500-year flood zone. We know we have trillions of dollars, this is in U.S. dollars, and global assets that are currently in the 100-year flood zone. And we recognize many of these assets cannot be relocated. Our major metropolitan areas are currently not shifting in a relocation fashion. And yet we do recognize in some locations we do have the opportunity to relocate certain elements of our infrastructure. We also have a variety of people living in incredibly low-lying areas where they're really vulnerable to the secondary storm surge hazards. So what we have got with sea level is basically a risk multiplier. where we have this underlying level of water that is continuing to rise on top of which we are experiencing storm impacts. We also know Africa is an area that's particularly vulnerable due to its rapid population growth and urbanization in areas of Egypt and sub-Saharan countries in Eastern and Western Africa. Some of the things that can be done to address sea level rise include, once again, promoting the collection of appropriate data, encouraging the use of standardized baselines. We need to adopt and implement national sea level rise plans. They may be as a component of other type of land use planning, and yet we must see sea level incorporated in many of these plans. There needs to be mechanisms put in place to assess and report on progress implementing resiliency measures to address sea level rise. For many people, it's often very good to share these important lessons learned, the case studies. This particular chapter has a case study from Australia. Other things that we need to be looking at related to sea level rise, including the mainstreaming of these plans and assessments, along with the management strategies for rural development planning, particularly in areas that are unique to the low-lying nature, these wetlands, the coastal floodplains, and any other areas prone to flooding. We also really need to be looking at our existing building codes to look at the impact of sea level rise. We'll also mention here, there are certain elements when you get into historic structures where you may have standards for what can be done to modify those structures, and we've learned that elevating structures can be some of the best things to do to protect those from risk, and yet we need to be looking at the historic character and fabric of those structures themselves. Now, we need to look at cooperation among diverse institutions and multiple scales, as we have heard. One thing we really have to include in here is the planning for post-storm and post-disaster information. With this information, we have been working within our own system here in the U.S. to look at areas where these are actually opportunities to adapt. And with that, meaning you have to have the planning in place before the storms themselves. We have to consider where we can relocate public facilities and infrastructure. The lower left image is one of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse in Cape Hatteras National Seashore, unit of the U.S. National Park Service. The lighthouse was relocated, and this is an example of one way to move historic structures away from risk. The lower right image is of working with some of our native peoples when we start talking about ethnographic resources that may be at risk, all the way from native plants to salmon to other types of resources that are very important to native peoples. Other sources of information that you may be able to draw from to get more local and regional specific information or other strategies that can be applied. In looking at the report on the left side of the screen, this is from the Australian government where they're actively planning for sea level rise. This 2015 document released their National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy. While Australia is an economically developed country, it can make adapting to sea level rise a bit easier because you can afford to pursue a variety of strategies such as seawalls, beach sand replenishment, subsidized managed retreat, etc. We do need to recognize that there are efforts underway to provide funding to promote management of marine resources as well as integrated coastal management programs where the topic of sea level rise can likely be most effectively addressed. Some other projects incorporate indigenous knowledge into their plans. For example, in Vanuatu, locals have relocated gardens for food inland, begun building their homes on stilts, and dug channels to redirect floodwaters. The image on the right is of the cover of the Region at Risk, the Human Dimensions of Climate Change in Asia and the Pacific. It's very important here to point out the role that we have of our industries in this role of adapting to sea level rise and recognizing the risk that our communities are facing. Back to the center image here is of some of the basic science understanding the impacts. This is a U.S. National Climate Assessment Report that is periodically updated. So as the information around sea level and related topics is improved, we can then once again provide additional information on the impacts to our stakeholders.